wisdom, time. JustProfessor here. You finally got good at something. Years of practice, real expertise. Now, someone asks you to explain it, and you can't. The words don't come. You don't know where to start. And when you try to teach it, you make it harder instead of easier. Your expertise just made you worse at explaining the thing you're best at. There's a curse that comes with expertise. The better you get at something, the harder it becomes to remember what it was like to not know it. You forget which parts are confusing for beginners. You skip steps that seem obvious to you but aren't obvious at all. You use terms and concepts that make perfect sense to you and no sense to anyone else. This is called the expert blind spot, and it's making experts terrible teachers while also making them worse at learning new things themselves. The expert blind spot happens when your expertise makes you unable to see your field from a beginner's perspective. You've internalized so much knowledge that you can't remember what it's like to not have that knowledge. Skills that took you years to develop now feel automatic and simple. Concepts that once confused you now seem obvious. You've forgotten the learning process you went through, so you can't guide others through it effectively. This creates a disconnect between what experts know and what they can teach. An expert understands their field deeply, but that deep understanding actually makes them worse at explaining it to non-experts. They assume too much background knowledge. They move too fast through basics. They focus on advanced nuances while skipping fundamental concepts. Their expertise blinds them to what beginners actually need. The problem goes both ways. Expert blind spot doesn't just make you bad at teaching, it also makes you worse at learning new things. You approach new fields with expert-level expectations. You get frustrated when you're not immediately good. You skip beginner resources because they seem too basic. You forget how to be a beginner because you've been an expert for so long. Your brain has changed through expertise. Neural pathways that once required conscious effort now operate automatically. Knowledge that once needed to be retrieved explicitly now gets accessed implicitly. This is what makes you skilled, but it also makes you unable to consciously access and explain the knowledge that's become automatic. You do things expertly, but can't describe how you do them. Let me show you how expert blind spot ruins teaching and learning in ways experts don't realize. Teachers with deep subject expertise often struggle with beginning students. A math professor who finds advanced calculus intuitive can't understand why students struggle with basic algebra. The professor's expertise makes simple concepts feel obvious. They can't see where students get confused because they've forgotten what confusion in this domain feels like. These expert teachers skip explanations that seem unnecessary to them but are critical for beginners. They use technical terms without defining them because the terms are part of their automatic vocabulary. They move quickly through foundations to get to the interesting advanced material. Students get lost, and the expert teacher doesn't understand why because from their perspective, everything was clear. Meanwhile, teachers with less expertise but more recent experience learning the material often teach it better. They remember being confused. They know which parts are hard. They can anticipate student questions because those questions are still fresh in their memory. The expert blind spot hasn't erased their beginner perspective yet. Tutorials and instructions get ruined by expert blind spot constantly. Someone who's been using software for years writes a tutorial for beginners. They skip basic navigation because it's automatic to them. They use shortcuts and features without explaining how to access them. They assume familiarity with concepts that beginners don't have. The tutorial is useless to actual beginners because the expert author couldn't see their own blind spots. You see this in cooking recipes written by professional chefs, fitness programs designed by athletes, business advice from successful entrepreneurs. The expert creates content from their current perspective, forgetting that beginners don't share their foundational knowledge, automatic skills, or intuitive understanding. Workplace training suffers from expert blind spot in specific ways. Experienced employees train new hires, but the experienced employees have forgotten which parts of the job are actually tricky and which parts just seem tricky. They demonstrate tasks at expert speed without breaking down the steps. They reference systems and procedures that are obvious to them but unknown to newcomers. New hires struggle and experienced trainers don't understand why because they've lost touch with the beginner experience. Technical documentation written by experts becomes incomprehensible. Engineers write manuals for products they designed. They understand the system completely, so they write from that complete understanding. They organize information logically from an expert perspective, but confusingly from a user perspective. They explain features technically instead of explaining what users actually need to know. The expert blind spot makes the documentation accurate but useless. Parenting shows expert blind spot effects, too. Parents develop expertise in managing their own kids. They forget how confusing and overwhelming early parenting was. When they give advice to new parents, they skip the basics that help them most. They focus on advanced strategies that only work once you've mastered fundamentals. Their expertise makes them give advice that's too advanced to be helpful. Academic fields develop entire cultures shaped by expert blind spot. Professors write papers for other experts using jargon and assumed knowledge that makes the content inaccessible to outsiders. They don't realize they're being unclear because everyone in their expert circle understands perfectly. The field becomes isolated and hard to enter because expert blind spot makes experts unable to communicate with non-experts. Expert blind spot makes learning new skills harder for experts in other fields. A successful lawyer tries to learn guitar. They expect rapid progress because they're used to being competent. They get frustrated with beginner struggles. They skip basic exercises because they seem too simple. Their expertise in law makes them worse at being a beginner guitarist because they've forgotten how to accept and work through the confusion of early learning. Experts in one domain approach new domains with expectations that don't fit. They want explanations at their usual level of complexity. They skip introductory resources. They jump to advanced material too quickly. Their expertise in other areas creates a blind spot for what beginning actually requires in a new field. Hobbies and interests develop micro-expert blind spots fast. You get into a hobby and learn the basics. 6 months later, someone new asks for advice on getting started. You realize you've already forgotten which parts were confusing, which resources helped most, what questions you had early on. Even moderate familiarity creates enough blind spot that you struggle to help true beginners effectively. Management suffers from expert blind spot in dangerous ways. Leaders who were once good at frontline work make decisions about that work without remembering how it actually feels to do it. They set policies and expectations based on their current expertise level understanding, forgetting the challenges that people still learning the role face. This creates disconnect between management expectations and worker reality. Expert blind spot affects how you evaluate your own explanations. You explain something, and it makes perfect sense to you. You think you were clear, but your audience is lost because you skipped steps you couldn't even see you were skipping. You're blind to your own blind spots, so you can't fix them without feedback from beginners who tell you what's missing. So how do you teach and learn effectively when expertise creates blind spots? How do you remember what it's like to not know what you now know? First, actively try to remember your own beginner experience. Before teaching or explaining something, think back to when you were learning it. What confused you? What questions did you have? What explanations helped? Reconnecting with your beginner self helps you see your blind spots. Second, watch beginners struggle and pay attention to where they struggle. Don't just correct their errors. Notice which parts trip them up. Those are your blind spots showing up. The things that seem obvious to you but cause problems for beginners are exactly what you need to explain better, but probably aren't explaining at all. Third, ask beginners what's confusing instead of assuming you know. Your expert perspective can't predict beginner confusion accurately. You need actual feedback from people currently experiencing the learning process you've forgotten. Fourth, break every task down into smaller steps than seems necessary. Your expertise makes you chunk actions together automatically. Force yourself to separate the steps. Explain things that feel too basic to mention. Beginners need those basic explanations even though they seem unnecessary from your expert view. Fifth, avoid jargon or define every term you use. Words that are automatic vocabulary for you are foreign language for beginners. You don't notice yourself using technical terms because they're part of your natural thought process now. Deliberately check for jargon and either eliminate it or explain it. Sixth, when learning new things as an expert, deliberately embrace being a beginner again. Use beginner resources even if they seem too simple. Progress slowly through fundamentals even if it feels boring. Remind yourself that confusion and slowness are normal parts of learning, not signs that something's wrong with the material or your ability. Seventh, find someone at an intermediate level to help with teaching. They're close enough to the beginner experience to remember what's confusing, but have enough expertise to explain it competently. They fill the gap created by your expert blind spot. Eighth, test your explanations with actual beginners before assuming they're clear. What makes sense to you might not make sense to others. Beginner feedback reveals your blind spots faster than your own analysis. Expert blind spot is making your expertise a barrier to teaching and learning instead of an advantage. The knowledge and skills that make you expert become automatic and unconscious. You lose access to the step-by-step process you used to gain that expertise. You forget what it's like to not know what you now know. This makes you skip crucial explanations, move too fast through fundamentals, and assume background knowledge that beginners don't have. The result is experts who are terrible teachers despite knowing their subject deeply. They can't explain what they do because they can't consciously access the automatic processes that make them skilled. They teach at their level instead of the learner's level because they can't see their field from a beginner perspective anymore. Expert blind spot also makes experts worse at learning new things. They've forgotten how to be comfortable with confusion and slow progress. They approach new fields with expert-level expectations that create frustration and lead to skipping essential basics. Their expertise in one area creates overconfidence and impatience that hurts learning in new areas. This is a specific cost of expertise that nobody talks about. Getting really good at something changes your brain in ways that make you worse at teaching that thing and worse at learning other things. The very mastery you worked hard to achieve creates blind spots you don't even know you have. Understanding expert blind spot doesn't automatically fix it. Your expertise will still create automatic processes you can't easily explain, but awareness helps you compensate. It makes you more careful about assumptions. It makes you seek beginner feedback. It makes you deliberately slow down and over-explain when teaching. It makes you more patient with yourself when learning something new. The next time you struggle to explain something you're expert at, or get frustrated learning something new, recognize expert blind spot at work. Your difficulty explaining isn't because you don't understand it well enough. It's because you understand it too well and have lost touch with what not understanding feels like. Your frustration learning isn't because you're bad at learning. It's because you've forgotten what being a beginner requires. Subscribe to discover more ways expertise and knowledge create unexpected problems in thinking and learning.